She was standing on my porch at 11:47 on a Thursday night soaking wet, with a duffel bag that looked like it had been packed in the dark, and she said, "I have nowhere to go." I remember the exact way she said it, not like someone asking for help, like someone reporting a fact they'd already made peace with, a small, tired statement delivered to the welcome mat more than to me, like she had practiced accepting the outcome before she'd even knocked. Her name is Nadia. She was 26 at the time, and she was my ex-wife's younger sister. Okay, let me back up. My name is Cal. Calvin Merritt, if my mother's calling, which she does every Sunday at 9 in the morning without fail, a habit she picked up when I moved out at 22 and has never seen fit to abandon. I'm 34 years old. I'm a Finnish carpenter by trade, which means I spend most of my days measuring twice, cutting once, and listening to podcasts in other people's houses while I build things designed to last longer than the marriages that commission them. That's a joke. Sort of. I do crown molding, custom cabinetry, built-ins, the kind of work that happens after the big noisy construction is done and someone needs a person who is precise and patient and doesn't mind being the last one on the job. I've been doing it since I was 20, when I apprenticed under a man named Gerald, who told me that the difference between a good carpenter and a great one was simply the willingness to slow down when everyone else was in a hurry. I've thought about that a lot over the years in contexts that had nothing to do with wood. I live alone in a house I bought 3 years ago, a small 2-bedroom in a neighborhood where the trees are old and the gutters are everybody's project every October. The previous owners had a dog and 2 kids in a vegetable garden along the back fence that had been left to go wild. And I kept it that way because I like the idea of something growing without being managed. It's a quiet life. I made it quiet on purpose. After years of trying to fill the silence with the wrong things, I had gotten pretty comfortable with the silence itself. My marriage to Dana ended 2 years before that night. I want to be fair about this because how I tell it matters. It wasn't catastrophic in the way people imagine when they hear the word divorce. There was no single blow-up. No one villain, no dramatic confrontation where all the unsaid things finally got said. There was just a long, slow accumulation of evidence that we had become 2 people who were very good at living in the same house and very bad at actually needing each other. We had been good together at the beginning, genuinely good, the kind of couple who finish each other's orders at restaurants and navigate airports without fighting. But somewhere in the middle years, we had optimized the partnership so thoroughly that we had optimized out the parts that made it worth having. We were efficient and comfortable and essentially alone together. And one night Dana looked at me across the dinner table and said, with more kindness than I deserved for how long I'd taken to notice, "I think we're better at being roommates than we are at being married." She was right. We both knew she was right. The paperwork took 6 months, and the adjustment took longer, but we parted without hatred, which is the best possible outcome for a marriage that ends. And I think we both meant it when we said we wished each other well. We haven't spoken since the paperwork cleared. And Nadia, Dana's younger sister by 5 years, had always existed at the edges of that relationship the way little sisters do when you marry into a family. Present at holidays, warm in passing, genuinely kind, in the specific way that people are kind when they're interested in you as a person rather than performing politeness for the room. I knew she was studying urban planning. I knew she had a sharp, dry sense of humor that she deployed quietly and then waited to see if you caught it. I knew she made Dana laugh harder than anyone else in the family could, which I'd always respected even when I didn't fully understand the dynamic. She was someone I knew well enough to ask how school was going and not quite well enough to know the real answer. The last time I'd seen her before that Thursday night was at a Christmas party 2 winters before the divorce when she was finishing her graduate degree and had opinions about zoning laws and transit-oriented development that I found genuinely interesting for reasons I didn't examine at the time. We'd talked for almost an hour in the corner of her parents' living room while everyone else circulated with their drinks, and she'd drawn a sketch of a transit map on a cocktail napkin to explain something she was working on, and I remembered thinking she was the kind of person whose mind made the world feel more organized just by being in it. And then I didn't see her for 3 years. And then she was on my porch. I said the only thing a person can reasonably say in that situation. "Come inside." She hesitated. Which I would remember later, the fact that even then, even standing in the rain with nowhere to go, Nadia Vasquez hesitated before accepting help. She looked at the doorway like she was calculating the weight of what she'd be asking by walking through it. I didn't know who else to call, she said, which wasn't an explanation, but I didn't push. You can call me, I said. Come inside. She came inside. Here's what I knew about the situation by the end of that first night. She had been living with her boyfriend of 3 years in an apartment across town, and the relationship had ended badly and abruptly in the way that relationships do when one person has been quietly building an exit for months and the other person had no idea. The signs had apparently been there. She said this without self-pity, the way she said most hard things, as a plain observation rather than a wound on display. She didn't want to go to Dana's because Dana had never liked the boyfriend and would say, "I told you so," in the specific warm and loving way that still feels like "I told you so." She didn't want to go to her parents because that would require a conversation she wasn't ready to have, the kind where people ask questions that are really just worry wearing a question mark, and she couldn't absorb their worry on top of her own that night. She had a friend she could have called, but the friend had a new baby and a 2-bedroom apartment, and the guilt of displacing a new mother would be unbearable. She had found my number in an old group chat from a holiday dinner that neither of us had ever left, one of those digital rooms that persists long after the event has faded. She said she almost didn't call. She said she sat in her car outside my block for 10 minutes before she got out. I gave her the 2nd bedroom. I gave her a towel and a spare set of socks because her feet were wet and cold. And I have a lot of spare socks because when you spend your days in work boots on job sites, dry socks are the one luxury you learn to stockpile without apology. I made her tea, the kind from the orange box that I buy because my mother sent it once years ago, a care package when I was going through the divorce, and I've bought it every week since without really thinking about why. She sat at my kitchen table with the mug between her palms and looked like someone waiting for the room to stop tilting. "You okay?" I asked. "I'll figure it out," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked up. She had her sister's eyes, dark and direct, but she used them differently. Dana's eyes were always moving, assessing, cataloging the room. Nadia's eyes just looked at you, steady and a little unnerving in the best possible way, like she had decided you were the thing worth looking at and was going to do it properly. "No," she said, "but I will be." "Okay," I said, "you can stay here while you figure it out." She opened her mouth like she was going to argue, and I held up a hand. "Don't thank me. Don't offer to pay rent. Don't set up any elaborate system of accounting for what you owe me. Just stay here until you have a plan." She looked at me for a long moment. That's very specific pushback for something I hadn't said yet. "You were about to say all of it." She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "How do you know?" "You were already doing the math as small coquille," I said. I could see it. She looked down at her mug. She didn't deny it. She stayed. That was in March. The thing about having another person in a house you've been living in alone for 2 years is that you suddenly notice how many of your habits are really just coping mechanisms that became routines. I noticed that I left every interior door open because the sound of them closing had started to feel wrong in the particular way that quiet houses develop their own strange acoustics. I noticed that I cooked dinner at 5:15 every evening without exception. Not because I was hungry at 5:15, but because showing up for myself at a fixed time was the closest I got to having someone to come home to. I noticed that I'd been watching the same 3 television shows on rotation for 6 months because they were predictable, and predictable had become my preferred emotional state. My neighbor Greta, who is 71, and has lived next door for 30 years and operates as an informal archivist of everything that happens on our street, had stopped asking if I was seeing anyone. I'm not sure if that was kindness or she just accepted the answer. Nadia was not predictable. She was, I discovered over those first days, a person who organized her environment with a kind of rigorous intention that made my own quiet order feel approximate by comparison. Within 4 days, she had reorganized the pantry. Not because it was disordered, I want to be clear about that. My pantry was fine. But as she explained with complete seriousness and without a trace of apology, the current system had no internal logic and was going to cost me time every single morning in small, invisible increments that I hadn't been tracking because I didn't have a framework for tracking them. She showed me the new system. She was right. I didn't admit that immediately. She made lists. Long, detailed lists on legal pads she bought from the drugstore 2 blocks over, lists that had subsections and priority markers and what appeared to be a color coding system maintained with 3 different pens, a blue, a red, and a green, each serving a purpose she never explained but that seemed internally consistent across every page. Lists for her job search, lists for apartment criteria ranked by weighted category, lists for the practical reconstruction of a life that had come apart at a seam she hadn't known was thin. I found them occasionally on the kitchen table or the counter by the coffee maker, and I got into the habit of not moving them because it was clear they were in exactly the place she had left them on purpose. Moving them would have been a kind of erasure. "Do you ever just decide something?" I asked her one evening, about 2 weeks in, without writing it down first. She was standing at the counter with one of the legal pads, a pen behind her ear, reviewing something with the focus of a person auditing a document they would be tested on later. "Do you ever," she said without looking up, "build something without measuring it first?" "That's different." "Is it?" I thought about it genuinely. "No," I said. "Then we understand each other," she said, and turned back to her list. The thing is, I did understand her. More than felt reasonable for someone I had only occupied the same general holiday table with for a handful of years. She was careful in the way I was careful, which is to say she wasn't naturally cautious. She had simply learned, the same way I had, that moving without looking cost you more than it saved you. She was funny in the dry, almost accidental way that I find more charming than jokes, the kind of humor where the wit is embedded so cleanly in a flat delivery that you're never entirely sure if it landed on purpose until she doesn't react to your laugh. She had opinions, strong ones, about infrastructure and traffic modeling and the ways cities fail the people living in them. And when she talked about her work, she became a different kind of animated, not louder but more precise, each sentence arriving like a measurement taken twice. She also, I noticed, never asked for anything she hadn't decided she was entitled to ask for. She'd use the kitchen and leave it cleaner than she found it. She'd tell me when she was going out and approximately when she'd be back. Not as an obligation, but as a courtesy that I found unexpectedly moving. She folded the throw blanket from the couch every morning and set it exactly where she'd found it. She was a guest who treated the house like a place she respected, which is a different thing from treating it like a place where she didn't belong. There were small things, specific things that accumulated the way small, specific things do when you're not trying to track them. She asked about my work one evening in a way that was clearly genuine rather than polite, and I ended up describing a custom built-in I was working on, a window seat with hidden storage for a house near the park, and she tilted her head the way she did and said, "That's a form follows function problem. The storage is load-bearing for the function, but it can't look like it." And I said, "Yes, exactly," and she nodded like we had confirmed something. We talked for 2 hours. I did not notice the time she started asking questions about the neighborhood, the kind of questions that were clearly professional habit. The transit access, the walkability, the logic of how the streets were laid out and where they failed the people who use them. We started walking in the evenings after dinner, not every night, but often enough that it became a thing, a habit without a name. She'd notice things I'd walked past 100 times. She'd point at an intersection and explain exactly why it was a problem and what the fix would cost and why no one had done it. I'd point at a house and tell her what the original trim work would have looked like before someone painted it the wrong color. We were speaking different languages that happened to be about the same things, the way built environments hold or fail the people inside them. I don't think either of us was trying to make it something. I think we were both just doing what two careful people do, which is letting a thing exist without naming it, because naming it creates an obligation, and obligations are how careful people get hurt. I want to be honest about what was happening during those weeks. I want to be honest because the alternative is telling a story that sounds cleaner than it was, and I have never been able to stomach the clean version of things when the complicated version is the true one. What was happening was that I was starting to enjoy having her there. Not in a nervous, hyper-aware way. Not in the way where you catch yourself looking forward to something and immediately begin talking yourself out of it. In a quieter way than that. The way you start leaving an extra porch light on without making a decision about it. The way you start making a slightly bigger pot of coffee in the morning without reasoning it through. I told myself it was hospitality. That it was simply good to have company after 2 years of a house that only ever held one person's sounds. That the relief I felt at the end of a workday pulling into the driveway and seeing the kitchen light on was just the ordinary warmth of not being entirely alone. I didn't let myself look at it directly. I was very disciplined about not looking at it directly. She got a job offer in the 5th week, an urban planning position with the city, doing transit corridor analysis for a new development initiative that she explained to me over dinner with a level of detail that should have been too technical to follow but wasn't, because she had the ability to make systems feel visible in a way that most people don't. She was pleased in the restrained, concentrated way she had of being pleased. Not giddy or expansive, but settled the way someone looks when a piece of a larger plan lands exactly where it was supposed to. "That's great," I said, and I meant it entirely, and I also felt something drop a full floor inside my chest that I chose, deliberately, not to acknowledge. "I'll start looking at apartments," she said, "in the neighborhoods near the office. I've been running the numbers on commute time versus rent, and there are 2 areas that make the most sense." "Of course you have," I said. "You say that like it's a character flaw." "I say it like it's extremely you." She tilted her head at me, that particular head tilt she did when she was deciding whether to push back or let something go. "Is that a problem?" "Not even a little," I said, and looked back at my food. And that was the end of that exchange in any practical sense, but I sat with it afterward in the way I sat with things I wasn't ready to name. The fact that I'd meant it, the particular warmth in my chest when I said it, the fact that I had very deliberately not meant it as a neutral observation and was now going to act as if I had. There was an evening in late April, about a week before Marcus came over, that I keep coming back to. It was a Friday, the end of a long week, and I'd come home from a job site with sawdust in my hair and a lower back that was making its opinions known, and Nadia was at the kitchen table with her laptop and her legal pad and 3 empty mugs that had accumulated over the course of the day. She looked up when I came in and said, without any particular weight to it, "There's leftover rice on the stove if you don't feel like cooking." And then she went back to whatever she was working on. And I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with that information, the specific ordinary care of it, and I thought, I am in trouble. And then I put my tools down and heated up the rice. Marcus had been my best friend since we were 11 years old and playing on the same little league team, which we were both genuinely bad at, which I believe is actually the fastest path to lasting friendship because there's nothing to be competitive about. He had grown up to be a high school history teacher and a devoted father and the kind of husband his wife called annoyingly decent, which she said with enough affection that it was clearly not a complaint. He lived 20 minutes away, had 2 kids and a golden retriever named Senator, who deserved a much better name, and he had known me long enough to identify the specific vocabulary of avoidance I employed when I did not want to say a true thing about myself. He came over one Saturday in late April, the 2 of us on my back porch with cold drinks and the afternoon light coming through the oak tree that hangs over the fence from the neighbor's yard, and he asked how things were going with the house guest situation. "Good," I said. "She got a job. She's going to start looking for her own place." Marcus said nothing for a moment. "Good," he said, in a tone that contained a significant quantity of layered subtext. "What?" I said. "Nothing." "Marcus?" I didn't say anything. "You said good the way my mother says fine?" He looked at his drink. He looked at the yard. He looked at me with the expression of a person who has been holding a particular card for weeks and has just decided the moment has arrived to put it on the table. "Cal," he said, "when did you last cook a real dinner for someone in this house?" "I cook dinner every night. For someone else." I didn't answer. "When did you last leave a light on for someone?" "That's a fire hazard argument, not a—" "When did you last actually care whether your house felt like somewhere a person would want to come back to?" I looked at the yard for a while. The wild vegetable garden at the back fence was starting to come back with the spring, something green pushing up through whatever had been there the previous year. "She's Dana's sister," I said. "Dana's ex-sister-in-law," Marcus said, with the careful patience of a teacher correcting an error they've seen before. "You're not related. You've been divorced for 2 years. Dana has, by your own account, moved to a different city, built a new life, and is very happily not thinking about you. None of that is actually the issue, and I think you know it. I don't know what the issue is, I said, which was not entirely true. Yes, you do, he said. You're scared, which is completely fine. Being scared of something that matters is appropriate, but you've got this thing you do where you rename scared as being careful, and you go through your whole life being extremely careful, and then one day you're 70, and you've been very careful indeed, and what does that buy you exactly? I hate when you do this. You always say that, and then you always admit later that I was right. I'm not admitting anything later. You will, he said, without any heat in it, just the flat certainty of a man who has been here before. He drank his drink and changed the subject, because Marcus has always understood that the most effective version of a hard truth is to say it clearly, once, and then leave it alone. He'd learned that from 20 years of trying to get teenagers to think about the past and applying it, apparently, to me. It sat. The thing he'd said sat in the specific way that true things do when you're not ready for them, which is to say it kept surfacing at inconvenient moments. It surfaced on Tuesday mornings when I noticed I'd started leaving for job sites 15 minutes later than I used to, timed so that I'd still be in the kitchen when Nadia came down for coffee. It surfaced on evenings when I found myself listening for the particular sound of her key in the front door, not anxiously, just with attention, the way you might listen for weather you'd been told was coming. It surfaced when she laughed at something I said, a real laugh, the involuntary kind that she seemed slightly surprised by, and I held on to it afterward in a way that felt disproportionate to the occasion. I kept noticing things. I noticed that I had started keeping the kitchen stocked with things she mentioned liking in passing. Specific crackers, a certain brand of sparkling water, the dark chocolate she broke into squares and ate methodically while she read one square at a time, rationed out with the same deliberate intention she brought to everything else. I noticed that when she mentioned the apartment search, I had a feeling I could only describe as resistance, a quiet and stubborn reluctance that I kept repackaging as concern for her readiness, or uncertainty about the rental market, or any number of practical considerations that sounded reasonable and were not the actual thing. The actual thing was that I had fallen quietly and entirely in love with someone who had shown up at my door in the rain with a duffel bag and nowhere to go, and the certainty of it was in direct proportion to how frightening it felt. And I had been very carefully, very deliberately, not thinking about it for 2 months. There was one night, about a week after Marcus left me with that thing sitting in my chest, when I came in late from a job that had run over and she was already in bed, but she'd left the porch light on and the kitchen light on and my dinner covered on the stove. I stood in the kitchen for a long time before I ate. I thought about Gerald, my old boss, telling me to slow down when everyone else was in a hurry. I thought about the way Nadia had hesitated on the porch that first night, the calculation she ran in the rain before accepting something she needed. I thought about how long I'd been running the same calculation in reverse, standing on the inside of my own house trying to decide if it was safe to want what was already here. I ate the dinner. I turned off the kitchen light. I left the porch light on. It came to a head on a Tuesday evening in May. She had been apartment hunting in earnest for 2 weeks by then, coming home with her legal pad dense with notes about square footage and ceiling height and natural light and proximity to the transit corridors she'd mapped. She had narrowed it to a short list, and she showed it to me over dinner because she was thorough about involving people in decisions that touched them, even obliquely, even me. 3 apartments, each one precisely chosen, each one making complete and defensible sense for the life she was in the process of rebuilding, each one located on the other side of the city. These all look good, man bin, I said. I think the second one, she said. The main room has east-facing light, better for working mornings. That's a good reason, I said. She looked at me, not at the list, at me. There was a pause that was not quite comfortable. Cal, she said, yeah. What are you doing? Looking at your short list. That's not what I mean. I set the legal pad down on the table. She was standing across from me in the kitchen, the room we had ended up in most evenings by some mutual unspoken agreement, and she was looking at me with the steady, direct look I had, by this point, fully memorized. I don't know what you mean, I said. It was my last and least convincing attempt at being careful. "You've been doing this thing for 2 months," she said, "where you are extremely kind and extremely present and also very deliberately standing about 3 feet further away from everything than you actually want to be." I said nothing. "I'm good with spatial reasoning," she said. "It's sort of my whole job." Something in my chest loosened that I hadn't known was clenched. "That's the funniest thing anyone has ever said to me while discussing something serious," I said. "I know," she said. "I did it on purpose." "Nadia? Cal? I don't want you to move to the apartment with the east-facing light." She held very still. The particular stillness of someone receiving information they had been waiting for but hadn't let themselves expect. "I want to be honest about why," I said, "because I've been not saying it for 2 months and I'm tired of that particular habit. The reason is not about the apartment or the east-facing light or the commute. The reason is that I have spent the last 2 months being genuinely, specifically happy to come home to this house, and I know exactly why. And I've been pretending not to because you came here when you were already hurt, and I didn't want to be another thing that made your life more complicated. And because your sister is a factor that I genuinely didn't know how to think about, and because I'm good at calling scared being careful, which someone recently made very clear to me." She was quiet. Not closed quiet. The other kind. "Who told you that?" she said. "Marcus." "I like Marcus," she said. "He'll be insufferable about this." "About what?" she said, and her voice had shifted very slightly the way a lock sounds just before the bolt pulls back. "About the fact that I'm telling you I'm in love with you," I said, "which I am. Which has been true for a while, which I understand may be complicated or unwelcome or badly timed or—" "Cal," she said. "Yeah." "I didn't call anyone else," she said. "I had the number of 4 people who could have let me in out of the rain that night. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I got out. And I called you." I looked at her. "I had reasons," she said, "and they were not only practical." The silence after that was different from every other silence we had accumulated over 2 months of shared space and careful distance. It was the kind of silence that isn't empty at all. It was the kind that has weight to it. Good weight. The weight of something finally set down. "What about Dana?" I said, because I needed to. "Dana," Nadia said, with the measured, considered calm of someone who has already worked through this particular variable and arrived at a conclusion she's confident in. "Got to choose first. She chose differently. That's not a permanent claim on anything." "That's very logical." "I'm a planner," she said. "I run the scenarios. I've been running this one for a while." "And you came up in all of them," she said. "That tends to mean something." She didn't move to the second apartment. She stayed for 3 more weeks in the spare room, which turned out to be the right amount of time, the appropriate distance between the admission and the next thing. And then she found a place 10 minutes away with east-facing light in the main room and enough counter space for the legal pads and a second desk she'd already measured and ordered before she'd signed the lease. I helped her move in because I know how to move furniture through doorways without taking the paint off the trim, and because I wanted to, and those are the same reason. When we were done, she made tea from an orange box tea bag she'd borrowed from my cabinet weeks ago and never replaced, just the one bag, and she made 2 cups, and we sat in her still half-assembled living room on a Sunday afternoon and didn't say much, which felt like everything. We have been together now for over a year. In that time, I have learned that she is a person who knows how to fight fairly, which is rarer than it should be. Our first real argument was in August about whether I was going to refinish her kitchen cabinets myself or hire it out, because she had a position on cost efficiency and I had a position on doing it correctly, and we were both, if I am being honest, also fighting about something else that had nothing to do with cabinets, the particular thing that couples fight about obliquely when they haven't yet found the exact vocabulary for it directly. The argument lasted 4 days. It ended when I showed up on a Saturday morning with the right stain and the right brushes, and she had already bought the sandpaper and set it out on the counter. Neither of us said the other person had been right. Neither of us needed to. We worked on the cabinets for most of the afternoon, and she made lunch, and we ate it on the floor because the table was covered in drop cloth. And that was when I understood that this was what it actually looked like. Not the good moments, which were easy, but the recovery from the friction, which is the thing that tells you whether you've found something that holds. She is better at the recovery than I am. I'm working on it. She is patient about the working on it in the way that she is patient about most things, which is not effortfully patient, but just genuinely, constitutionally unbothered by the pace of things taking the time they take. She says it's the planner in her. I think it's just her. Greta, my neighbor, saw Nadia leaving my house one morning in September and came over that afternoon while I was in the yard and told me, with the authority of someone who has been watching this street for 3 decades, that it was about time. I told her it was complicated. She told me that everything worth anything was complicated and that I should stop acting like that was an excuse and go inside and call whoever she was. I did not point out that I didn't need to call her because she was already coming back for dinner. I just thanked Greta and went inside. Marcus claimed all credit at the first dinner the 4 of us had together in late September with such confident and enthusiastic self-congratulation that Nadia, who had been quietly forming her opinion of him all evening, ended up spending the second half of the meal using Senator the dog as an emotional support animal to get through it. Senator, for his part, was delighted by the attention and has been loyal to Nadia ever since in the unambiguous way that dogs are loyal to people who scratch exactly the right spot. Marcus eventually settled down when his wife told him to, which is the usual mechanism. I let it go because Marcus wasn't wrong, and the price of that is occasionally having to sit across from him while he knows it. I still think about that night in March sometimes. 11:47. Her on my porch, in the rain with the duffel bag, that small, exhausted voice delivering the fact of her situation to the welcome mat. I have nowhere to go. She said it like it was the conclusion of something, like she had arrived at the end of a sequence and was simply reporting her coordinates. She was at a low point and could not see the angle from inside it. That is the thing about low points. The geometry is invisible until you're past them, and you can turn around and look. I know something about that. I spent 2 years making a house quiet enough to feel like a choice and not an absence, and it took someone knocking in the rain to show me the difference. There is a thing she says sometimes when she's finished a hard problem at work. When a transit corridor finally resolves on paper the way she needed it to, she says, "The system works when every part of it knows what it's for." I think about that more than I probably should. I think about the pantry reorganized into logic. I think about the porch light I left on before I knew I was leaving it on. I think about the orange box tea my mother sent me once that I've never stopped buying. Systems, small and unhurried, that knew what they were for before I did. We've been together for over a year. She still keeps the legal pads, all of them. Every one she's filled since March, stacked on a shelf in her apartment in reverse chronological order because that is how she files things, most recent on top, history underneath. Accessible, but not in the way. There's also a stack on my kitchen table that migrated there gradually and has become permanent in the way that things become permanent when no one makes a decision to remove them. I've stopped trying to understand it and started trusting that it makes sense to her, which is a different thing from not caring and an important distinction. Last week I was watching her work through something at the kitchen table, 3 pens deployed, 2 active pads, whatever transit problem the city had given her that week. And she looked up after a while the way she does, direct and steady and still a little unnerving in exactly the way I have come to love. And she said, "You're doing that thing where you're watching me like you're about to say something." I was. I said, "What?" "You have nowhere to go tonight," I said, "right? Nowhere you'd rather be." She looked at me for a moment. The quiet kind of look that I have memorized from every angle. "Nowhere," she said, and went back to her work. And I went back to mine. And the house felt exactly the way a house is supposed to feel. Full without being crowded, warm without being loud, the kind of place where the important things don't need to be announced because they're already known. Have you ever had someone show up at exactly the wrong time and turn out to be exactly right? Or have you ever spent so long being careful about something that you almost missed what was standing right there in the rain waiting for you to open the door? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.